It's Friday, April 24th. I'm coming to you live at a church basement in Irpin, Ukraine, in suburban Kiev. Not only do we have a coronavirus pandemic, we have, as the New York Times called it, a Skype or a Zoom epidemic. This is how we meet nowadays, and so I think we better get used to it. The situation today in Kiev, or in Ukraine, is we're approaching 200 deaths. We have more than 7,000 infections. The government this week announced that restrictions, the quarantine that started on March 12th, is going to last until May 12th. So that's 2 full months where the economy is pretty much closed down or working remotely. Some sectors obviously getting hit worse than others. It looks like we had some stories in the Key Post today about how Ukraine is lagging in testing compared to other countries. For instance, Germany, the leader, is doing 50,000 tests a day. Ukraine hopes to do, according to the Prime Minister, 5,000 a day. So that still is far behind, and testing is key to, the experts tell us, to identifying how the extent the virus has spread and combating it early and stopping the spread further. So we're going to look, today's topic is post-COVID world and Ukraine's economy. We have an all-star panel with us tonight and coming to you live. I want to thank the sponsor, DTEK, the largest energy company in Ukraine. It's easier to say what they don't do. They are involved in oil, natural gas, electricity generation, renewables. Maxim Timchenko is the CEO. So we thank them for allowing us to convene this experts and try to cut through the fog and hopefully map out a future today. Let me start by introducing our speakers. Anders Aslin is somebody I know quite well. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, author of many books, including the most recent one, Russia's Crony Capitalism, The Path from Market Economy to Kleptocracy. He is a frequent commentator, and if you have time, follow him on Twitter. He has a very excellent Twitter feed. Next, I want to introduce Willem Buiter. He's an independent economic advisor, visiting professor at Columbia University. His biography includes almost a decade with the Citigroup. He is also the author of 6 books and a frequent commentator on global economic developments. Olga Malaletska is the head of the Office of National Investment Council, who will need quite a bit when we get out of this quarantine and the coronavirus epidemic. She's been there since, I believe, January 2017. She's also worked in many other places, Ukernafta. She's been in the Ministry of the Economy and so forth. She also highly interested in technology innovations. Since 2013, she did several venture capital investments and became a co-founder of 2 startups in the education and IT education sphere. Jason Pelmar is the regional manager for the International Finance Corporation for Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. The IFC has more than $3 billion in long-term investments in Ukraine, another $300 million in Belarus, and $200 million in Moldova. He is based in Kiev, so he's coming to us from Kiev. I think as well as Olga, Anders, and Willem are in the States, in Washington. So let's get started. I want to ask probably the unanswerable, because we're not in the post-COVID world, but already the economic statistics are gloomy. So if you can't answer how bad the damage is, can you give us some sense of your fears and how we're going to come out of this quickly, slowly? Let's start with Willem, I guess.
Well, we're likely to come out of this quite slowly and in waves. In other words, we will start relaxing whenever, late May, June, the social distancing requirements, and find a month later, 2 months later, that we have to reimpose a possibly milder version of the same regime. But this will drag out, I think, well into the end of the year. Once we are back to normal labor utilization, of course, the external environment of Ukraine, the global economic environment, will have changed permanently. I anticipate, I'm not the only one here, the fund is with me, slower global growth. Partly because investment incentives will be on hold. The precautionary motive causes people to abstain from taking risks. Saving behavior will be focused on caution. That will drive down global interest rates. So we're going to be stuck in this advanced country, ludicrously low interest rate environment. It's doubtful that all of Ukraine's foreign remittances will come back. I mean, in 2019, there was 15.8 billion, according to the World Bank, worth of remittances in Ukraine. Across low-income, middle-income countries, there's been a 20% cut. I doubt that it's much lower than that in the US, in Ukraine. And I expect that it will be hard to get back the Ukraine previous levels of remittances. FDI will be more cautious, inevitably, as a result of COVID-19, and the failure to stick to reforms, and indeed the tendency to backtrack on reforms committed to during the COVID period is likely to hurt the investment climate in the medium term. So I see a tougher slowdown while the COVID virus is preying on the Ukraine. I think the official numbers that the government came up with, which was, what was it, minus 4.2% for 2020, and then plus 2.4% of GDP, is simply wishful thinking. The pain will be a lot greater, and the long-term pain, unless there is a drastic commitment to reforms, is going to be a lasting one.
That's grim. So are you selling your stocks?
I've already sold my stocks.
Okay.
All right. No, it's capitalism, right, has gotten an enormous kick where it hurts, because we have a combined demand and supply shock, which then feeds into a financial shock. You haven't seen that ever before, not even in the great financial crisis. And it will take a significant amount of time before we wrestle out of that triple chain.
Okay. Do we have the statistics going around the screen? It's been pretty dismal. Anders, can you build on this, and what do you see the big picture?
Yeah, no, I think that the big picture is that the European Union is likely to lose 10% of its GDP approximately this year. And then you relate Ukraine to this. Will Ukraine do better or worse? I would guess slightly better, say 8% of GDP, for the reasons that Ukraine has, as you said, more agriculture and iron ore. And these are industries that are doing quite well. Agriculture prices do not fall in a depression because people need to eat, while all other the prices of all other raw materials fall. And what is really stopping is personal services, restaurants and haircuts and passenger transport, tourism. All that is stopping. And Ukraine has comparatively little of these things. So Ukraine should come out slightly better. We have been greatly worried about a financial crisis in Ukraine. Now it seems as if it's not so likely. I was quite happy to see yesterday that the National Bank cut the interest rate from 10 to 8%, and that there was no negative reaction on the exchange market. The hryvnia now seems to have stabilized at around 27 hryvnia per dollar, which I think is a reasonable exchange rate for the time being. And Ukraine still has large reserves of $26 billion. It's vital to get an IMF agreement really to secure it. But right now the situation is stable, and there is a presumption that there will be an IMF program coming in very soon. So I'm not so worried on the financial side. And of course, Ukraine is benefiting from the collapse of the oil prices. Not that it's such a big thing, but it's a positive. And with regard to how long will it last, my simple assumption is that this will last for 3 months. So the quarantine started on the 12th of March. Now it has been prolonged to the 12th of May, as you mentioned, Brian. And I would presume that it will be prolonged by another month. If one compares with Central Europe, Ukraine has been later in getting the epidemic, but Ukraine started closing down earlier than Central European countries did in the most regard. So Ukraine's strong suit has been that it closed down early. Its weak suit, as you mentioned, has been testing. Ukraine is lying behind in testing and should not focus heavily on getting the testing right. We have now close to 8,000 people who have been infected. We are seeing that there is a strong regional imbalance in it. They are primarily in Kiev and in the western parts of the country. And we will see when the Central Europeans now gradually are starting opening up, that Ukraine will have people coming in from the west, in particular from Poland, since there are so many Ukrainians in Poland, while Poland is not deeply infected, but approximately as Ukraine. There will be a traffic that will be difficult to control. So say that almost 1/10 of GDP will disappear, which is half as much as in 2009 when it was 15%, or in 2014 and 15 when it was 17% of GDP that disappeared. Ukrainians are unfortunately used to suffering, and this will be another amount of suffering. What I would particularly call for first is, of course, financial stability that has see good likelihood of right now, fortunately. And the other is big deregulation. We are now seeing that hundreds of thousands, if not a million or two, of Ukrainians who have been working abroad are returning home. This should be seen as a great possibility. These people, by and large, have some money so that they can build a house or set up an enterprise. So they should be encouraged to use the skills that they have developed to set up their own enterprises. And this should be seen as a massive resource. In recent years, we have complained about brain drain from Ukraine. Now we have a brain gain, and that brain gain should be given a free life so that it can really develop. So this could be a great opportunity for Ukraine. And of course, agriculture is developing, and with a new land market reform law, it should develop even more. And Ukraine has a good high-tech sector, and the European supply chain is reaching in to Ukraine. So basically, I think that however terrible this crisis is, that Ukraine looks slightly better than other countries that we are looking at.
Anders, before we go with Jason and Olga, who are really on the ground, how, and you touched a bit about it, and one great thing about being experienced guys is we've lived through a lot of this, 1998 ruble collapse, 2008, 2009 global financial, 2014, 2015. That was more caused by the revolution and Russia's war. And this one, but it always seemed that Ukraine suffered worse than everybody else around them. I'm hearing you say it might not be the case this time. The other thing is, I think The Economist has the cover this week, will leave the rich world deep in debt, and Ukraine is also, you know, the IMF took the lid off deficit spending. Ukraine is going to run up a 7% debt on GDP, 11 billion.
Budget deficit.
Yeah. Is there going to be a price to pay, or we shouldn't worry about that now? And then if you can talk about sort of the historical, maybe these are completely different recessions that we've lived through.
Yeah, what you are really pointing to is that Ukraine has always been in a severe financial crisis with almost no reserves at all and big budget deficits. In this case, Ukraine is going in with a budget deficit of just over 2% of GDP. It has a current account deficit of only 2% of GDP also. And as Willem mentioned, that is more than compensated for by these large remittances, which the World Bank now thinks will fall by 1/4. But there would still be remittances coming. Ukraine has now international reserves of $26 billion in early 2014. After Yanukovych has robbed everything, it was down to $5 billion. So that was a real critical situation. So the big difference is that Ukraine is not in a financial crisis as yet, and therefore has room. That's why Ukraine always did worse before, because it was in a severe financial crisis. And now we are seeing that the international financial markets are freezing up, but Ukraine does not really need to go there for the time being.
Are you worried about the debt? I mean, the Economist said first the cure, then the debt. Well,
the average debt in the world is 350% of GDP. Ukraine has a public debt of 50% of the GDP.
Right.
The average debt in the European Union is probably 70% of GDP now.
But won't that affect Ukraine? Won't that affect Ukraine somehow with all this debt swirling around the world? No?
Not really. I mean, it will depress growth generally in the world, as Willem talked about. But Ukraine looks slightly better than average from these perspectives.
That's good to hear. I want to get...
This is the time to support households and non-financial companies through the budget, if there ever was one. Right? Not leave to banks, which are not the vehicles to do the job in this crisis.
That hasn't been happening, and I'm not sure about the financial means of Ukraine to do that. And as you know, lending has been, it's more affordable now with what the NBU is doing, but that sector has not been, but that would be great if the credit sector resumed. I want to talk, get Olga and Jason in here to talk about, I mean, both kind of, when the world is idle now and frozen, I'm sure it's got to be difficult at the National Investment Council. What are the steps government that you're doing, international financial organizations, that people, you know, National Investment Council, business need to do to be in place to benefit from the recovery?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we faced the uncertainty, and we do not know how last it could be and how long it could be. And actually, I also don't have the crystal ball and the answer what should the National Investment Council and Ukraine Invest and all the other IFIs in Ukraine do in order to boost the investments and to have the FDI inflow. And in this let's say post-pandemic world, it would be let's say Ukraine is not really on the, say, on the first pages of the newspapers now. You have only COVID there. It's not like we had before. We do not have the Vyshyvanka times right now. But anyway.
Do you miss the attention from the Trump impeachment when we were on the front page?
Exactly. We needed to use that time. And now you see only COVID here.
Yeah. I mean, obviously investment is, well, it was never great, you know, in our history in Ukraine, foreign direct investment. But is everything just at a standstill now? And what do you do in this case?
In this case, we started the, let's say, the analysis of sectoral analysis and understanding what should we do and in which sectors to, let's say, to invest further, like after the pandemic situation, and what to do there. So it's under the work in progress in this situation, and we have with some of the parties involved, and also one of the consultancy company, the name I will not be mentioned over here. So that won't be, let's say, the promo for them. So we have several weekly calls in order to understand what should we do, what should Ukraine do, and in which directions as well. And for me, it's also interesting to learn after, or maybe now today from Jason, because previously we had, let's say, a lot of hopes for the infrastructure sectors and also for the, let's say, air transportation, and we considered the regional airports and airports as one of the, let's say, one of the sectors for the concessions, and also lots of money inflow into Ukraine. And now, as with the, all the cuts in the transportations and all the stopped lines over here, we know. Let's say nobody is considering this as a sexy topic and even interesting. And when it recovers, we don't know. So
let me come in here because that's
no, I'm stopping here. So it was my answer. So what should we consider and not?
No, thank you, thank you. Jason, take it away.
Yeah, no, so I think that was a little, I think maybe sexy is not the right word, but there still is a lot of attention on infrastructure. And I think the very topic of the discussion is post-COVID, right? So we're in a bad place now. How do we get out of it? But let's take a quick history lesson. If we had this discussion 3 months ago, or even 2 months ago, the economy was growing at 3.2%, and we were discussing how we get that to 7%. And there was a genuine avenue that was recognized as the way to achieve that goal. And the infrastructure concession projects that Olga just referenced was one of those avenues. But before we go there, I think we've heard of where we are now, right? We are in a crisis. We've heard from Willem and Anders that the vectors of how the economy is being impacted is very much through disposable income, through lower remittances, through lower commodity prices. And this pain is real. So what do? We can't lose sight of the reforms, and I think Willem also alluded to this. The country has significant external debt, although along the lines of its Western European peers. But this is still 6% of GDP per annum from 2020 to 2022. And external financing will be needed, and hence why Anders is saying the IMF financing package is critical. It's critical because it's necessary resources that the country needs now, and it will also unlock additional financing from the EU and the World Bank. So we're waiting for Parliament to take the necessary actions and complete those conditions. In addition to that, we also can't lose sight of corporate governance reform at the state-owned banks and the state-owned enterprises. And we heard from Anders about land reform. This is great that Parliament has ended the moratorium. The land reform is moving forward, but that's not the end of it. There's additional legislation that still needs to be passed to ensure transparency and efficiency. And the quantum of land that could be sold is still not really enough to have the economic impacts that we were hoping for. And I think restricting foreign ownership is something that will need to be addressed later on, again, to have that kind of economic impact. So coming to what do we do about it? IFC globally has $8 billion of rapid response financing, which is going to make sure that companies continue to operate, and our first and foremost concern is to preserve jobs. And so in this crisis, we need to make sure that people remain employed, which is critical not only for the now, but also in the COVID response, the post-COVID world. What can we do in addition? The 8 billion, how does that apply to Ukraine? We talked about getting banks to lend again. So we're providing working capital to financial institutions as well as to our clients. And we're doing this in the region, in Ukraine and globally. And this should open up more lending, particularly again to the micro and small and medium-sized enterprises. So you'll be hearing more success stories in that regard from IFC in Ukraine and the region shortly. Coming to infrastructure, it is about the big concessions. The two pilot port concessions, Olbia and Kherson, continue. So these concessions should be signed in the coming months. And the investors that won these bids, these were projects that were structured by IFC and EBRD. We ran competitive tenders for the benefit of the Ministry of Infrastructure, and are bringing in and will continue to succeed in bringing in foreign direct investment. Olga, what does that mean in terms of some of the other projects? I'm still very bullish on roads. The country needs roads, and I think the president and the government remain very positive on roads, and we will continue to build on this analysis and at the right time launch tenders. And then health is also a critical sector. I think we recognize that there are further advancements that are necessary for the general health of the population. And also, God forbid, we're in a pandemic number 2 or number 3 that the government is prepared. And so I think health PPPs are something that we want to further. And regional airports, I agree. I mean, right now, it doesn't sound like the right time. But we will get back, and maybe it's not tomorrow or next month or the next year, but passenger traffic will pick up, and Ukraine needs to be ready, and we will help the government in making sure that you are ready. In the agri space, we just had a major celebration to recognize a milestone of $1 billion plus of crop receipts. This is an instrument that IFC developed in Brazil, rolled out in Ukraine, and took it from 0 to 1 billion over a very short period of time, providing financing to small farmers. Again, coming back to the need for finance. And we're thinking forward, and maybe we can come to this later in the discussion, about what else we are thinking about. Again, thinking forward 1, 2, 3 years in terms of what it is that we can bring much needed investment into the economy. I'll stop there.
Jason, you mentioned a lot of things on the reform agenda, all very good. You didn't mention the banking law, which is the key. I assume your IFC is in agreement with the IMF on the need for this?
So there are two main sectors that I left out. Again, I wanted to not monopolize the conversation, but the banking sector and the banking sector reforms at large are obviously critical. And it's more than just the contemplated legislation necessary for the IMF program, but it's Ukraine still has some of the highest non-performing loans globally. The positive news is that we have a new cabinet resolution, a new NBU National Bank of Ukraine regulation that will allow the state-owned banks to resolve their NPLs, which is fantastic, recent, and something that IFC will be able to build on to ensure that there's private sector investors that can actually work out these non-performing loans. And that's another avenue that we're going to explore. We have 4 state-owned banks. It was the prior government's and this government's priority to privatize these state-owned banks, and IFC is playing a leading role in the privatization of the state-owned banks. And then another area is fintech. And I think globally we're recognizing that there's a need for digital finance, particularly during these times. And we are beginning to create a framework such that Ukraine will be global leaders in having a fintech ecosystem. And again, while I have the floor, I'll continue in terms of agri. Dairy sector, I think, is an area that has promise and will continue to have promise in a post-COVID world. And we have a study already in hand that demonstrates Ukraine can be competitive in the dairy industry. It likely will require foreign direct investment, and it will help in making sure that investors will come to Ukraine to build out the dairy sector. On the back of the land reform, making sure that our agri clients can now use their land for collateral. Irrigation is another area where Ukraine is lagging. But again, thanks to land reform, we think farmers will start investing in irrigation. And finally, grain storage is an area where there's a real need for additional grain storage facilities that we have identified the need and are in the process of putting together further thinking on what it's going to take to bring more investment, domestic and foreign, into grain storage in Ukraine. So there's a lot to be done. We're not stopping. We're continuing to invest in all of these areas and urban infrastructure. I haven't even gotten to all the municipal finance. Our city clients with whom we're helping on urban transportation, grain transport, the city of Lviv and Mariupol, Kryvyi and Zaporizhia. So lots to be done, Brian.
I should ask you this at the beginning, the $3 billion investment portfolio, that's largely infrastructure and agriculture, or are there other sectors?
No, so a bulk of our portfolio is in that space, yes. But it is a very diversified portfolio, and we're seeing a lot of demand in other areas where we hadn't previously seen.
And this $8 billion rapid fund, is that already money going out the door to existing clients to help them through downturns right now?
Indeed. No, so I think I'm very impressed, boasting of my own institution, but the quickness that we were able to roll out this facility is impressive. And the money is already beginning to reach our clients in need globally and soon in Ukraine.
Are you taking steps to boost irrigation by making farmers pay for the water they use, or is that still a bridge too far?
Sorry, Willem, I didn't catch that.
The use of 70% of water use is agricultural, and it tends not to be paid for. Right? Is your irrigation program, do they bring in a mechanism for charging for agricultural use of water?
Yeah, so I think this is the big topic, right? And right now there is no model in Ukraine. So I think that the key is to come up with a commercial mechanism such that we can bring investment. Right now you have massive wastage, and because farmers didn't own the land, there was no collateral that enabled them to borrow to invest in this infrastructure. So the work that IFC is undertaking is to develop a commercial model that works for Ukraine to get water usage, to improve efficiency, and to get it where it's needed most. And again, this is becoming even more acute given climate concerns and drought concerns for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're a little bit more than halfway through our conversation. I'm Brian Bonner from the Kyiv Post. We're here discussing the post-COVID world and Ukraine's economy. I wanted to ask, you guys can bring the discussion where you think it's best, but this idea of who's going to be the winners and losers from this, and how a person like Olga positions her investment pitch coming out of this crisis. It seems like a very uneven crisis. Some sectors, like newspapers, devastated or facing devastation, and other sectors like agriculture, very, except for the depression, prices a little bit untouched. And after Ukraine is able to attract again, how should it position itself? Anybody?
Let me start with
Or you want to talk about something else?
No. Let's say if we are talking about the sectors that affected the most, I will not tell like something which is not obvious, that it is energy due to also the oil prices, as well the infrastructure. It's also because of the transportation drop and all the, let's say, passengers inflow, and all the in-country and through country transportation is stopped, not only for the aviation but also for Ukrzaliznytsia, and I suppose that Ukrzaliznytsia also will have some of the losses, about 20% maybe in comparison to the previous year what they have. So Anders can also comment after that if you have any projections on that. Also, it's metallurgy industry, and we can see the drop in prices and the demand and labor markets, and this let's say this is a global trend in terms of the people who are laid off, and now we have in Ukraine it's almost like I think 2.8 million of the people without work, and we won't see that it could be better or not. I suppose in US it's even much worse. You mentioned previously it's about 26 million now, and they're supposed to have it about 40. So I can also confirm that in Ukraine it seems like a bit better situation, but let's see. And also we had a lot of people who came back to Ukraine and previously were working in let's say in EU countries. So in Ukraine we have to have work for them, either work for them or the possibility to open up new businesses. And I hope with such programs like government also pushed its updated 579 loans, also when you can start your small business and open up some like small entity. And also you mentioned like a barbershop after in post-COVID world, that could be a possibility for them to be employed and to be working here and start a business. And we also know that not only the large corporations, they bring, let's say, business into Ukraine, but all the countries, they rely more or less on the SMEs, and we have to have this sector working in a good way. So what sectors are not affected and in my view also booming, like you mentioned several times about Zoom. So capitalization of Zoom is I checked before, it's I think 1779 or something like that. So it's huge increase in comparison how it was even 1 month ago. And we even we now using Zoom. I'm not sure about Skype because for this 1 month and a half of working from home regime, we are almost using Zoom all the time. So it's more and more of that. And for me in IT sphere, the companies also they have to switch, let's say, from capex to opex, and over here I mean that some of the companies, so let's say software producers, they have to switch to subscriptions and provide, let's say, the services to their clients in a subscription based, and this is for their clients would be the operational expenses, and it's not that costly as it was with the capital expenses. So let's say they switch in their models and like providing their services and products would be better to consider. And
about the
yeah.
unemployment figure, you said 2.8 million unemployed in Ukraine. Is that did I hear you correctly?
Yeah, you get me.
How confident are you in that figure?
Let's say
it seems low. I mean, the unemployment.
That would be provided to me.
Right. No, I mean, I know I think that, I mean, that's the official figure, but I'm just wondering how confident how well Ukraine counts its unemployed. I mean, in America, I know, people file for benefits right away, so you get an easy count. Maybe, Anders, I wanted to talk about America's bailouts, which Ukraine doesn't have the option of doing, throwing billions in sectors, and energy prices. It's funny for me to hear that low energy people mourn low gas prices, low oil prices. You're of the mind that this is positive for the global economy and positive for democracy. Did I get that right?
Indeed. If you have low oil prices, who doesn't get money? Dictators in oil countries. Traditionally, you have 7 countries that are rich and are still authoritarian. And it's Singapore, which is a small outlier, and then it's 6 oil countries, 4 in the Gulf, Brunei, and then Russia. If oil becomes cheaper, Russia will lose a lot of money. It will be difficult for Putin to stay in power. And other countries in that situation are Iran and Venezuela, quite developed countries that are authoritarian. We saw when the oil price was low, from 1981 to 2000, that democracy thrived in the world. We had what Samuel Huntington called the third wave of democratization going through the world. Since 2005, when the oil price has been high, we have Freedom House notices that the number of authoritarian states have increased and the democratic states have declined. So it's time to turn that around, and that's what a low oil price can do. And what do the dictators do with their oil income? They pursue wars. I can give you 3 wars that I think could abate because of a low oil price. Russia's and Iran's activities in Syria, Saudi Arabia's war against Yemen, and generally the war in Libya, where various countries are interested because Libya has so much oil. If oil is close to worthless, why would you like to go and fight a war in Libya? And over to you, the first part of your question, how the money should be spent. I'm highly critical of how the money is being spent in the US because it's being spent on the big corporations rather than small and medium-sized enterprises, or what Willem talked about, money in these situations should go to people. People means demand for services and products, so the money goes to the right enterprises. If you bail out the big companies, you conserve them, you reduce competition, and you reduce innovation. This is exactly what Putin did in 2008, 2009. He gave money, massive amounts of money to the big enterprises. And the consequence of this was that Russia had huge amounts of money spent on fiscal stimulus, but Russia's economy has been close to stagnant ever since, because the small good enterprises that we want to support, they were crowded out. And I fear that the US is doing exactly the same. So as Olga mentioned, the US is aiming to 40 million unemployed, or it might be 50 million, which would mean 25 to 30% unemployed. This is an unsustainable model, and it's not good. It means that restaurants and bars and whatever, they will close on a massive scale, and they will not come back fast. So I don't believe in any return to growth here in the US. Europe is doing something completely different, where the German model of Kurzarbeit is dominant. You work 3 to 4 days a week, and the government provides funding. Now, virtually the whole of Europe has adopted that model, and Ukraine automatically has it, because it takes 3 months to lay anybody off in Ukraine. First, you have to give notice for 2 months, and then you have to give a severance pay for 1 month. And if we assume that the quarantine, the closure of many enterprises will last for 3 months, then it means that people will not really become unemployed in Ukraine. You asked about the employment number in Ukraine. It is very remote, because there are always millions of people who are outside of the labor market in Ukraine, and we don't really know what they are doing. Probably 6 million Ukrainians are outside of the country, mainly working in various EU countries, probably 2 million in Poland. And then you have a lot of people who are simply pursuing subsistence agriculture on the private plots, and they get around on it, but it's outside of the formal economy. Nothing illegal, it's just that it is an informal, poor economy. So there are many things about the Ukrainian labor market that we don't know, but Ukraine is not likely to get this massive unemployment that we are seeing already in the US. Think of it, it's already 16% unemployment in the US as it is today. Europe is not seeing this at all. And I think therefore that the US is likely to come out worse of this crisis, because the money is going in the wrong direction.
Money's going in the wrong direction, so maybe it's a blessing in disguise that Ukraine is not able to bail out entire sectors. Robert Reich, another Twitter, bail out people, not corporations, he says.
Yeah, but let me tell you another example. In 99, Russia had, 98, 99, Russia did not have money to bail out the big enterprises. What happened? They went bankrupt. New young businessmen took over the old Soviet enterprises, and it turned out that they could be turned around in many cases and could be highly productive. And after that, Russia had high economic growth for 10 years. And while after 2009, Russia had low economic growth for a decade. So sometimes you need to change owner of enterprises in order to make them functioning better. Bankruptcy does not mean the end of an enterprise necessarily. It mostly means that somebody else is taking over. And if the old owner didn't know what to do with it, it's better to try with a new owner.
Anders, while I have you here, I mean, do you think the low energy prices are a permanent feature? Certainly Trump, Putin, and the Saudis are trying to, and OPEC are trying to reverse that.
I think that we have long cycles when it comes to commodity prices of 30 years or so. We had low prices for 2 decades, from 81 to 2000. And then we had rising and high prices until 2014, you can say for 14 years. And since 2014, we have seen lower prices. What is driving this? It's very much the investment boom that China pursued, which is now abating. So China has takes 30 to 50% of many of the important raw materials like cement and steel, less of oil, but still it's China's hunger for commodities that has driven the commodity boom. Now it's over. Nobody has replaced China or is likely to do so. So I think that we'll see a decade or so of low commodity prices.
10 minutes, and I wanted to have our guests talk about freeform, what they want to talk about. But the final question I would have as the moderator is, are you satisfied with the government messaging and the government response in Ukraine? I mean, as compared to maybe other countries, it seems there's a lot of messaging that's maybe not consistent. You know, they talk about no airplanes till fall. We're going to be 2 years. We all have to wear masks. And there are some scary figures coming out of analysis in Ukraine, which is like 30% of retailers won't open up once the quarantine is lifted. They're just dead, along with restaurants and other street-level commerce. I wanted to know how you assess the government's messaging, response. Do you think they're on top of it? And then I wanted to ask you guys to talk about whatever I didn't get to that you think is relevant today. Ladies first. The lady first. Okay,
about the government, let's say not all the messages they are consistent. I agree with you, but some of them, I believe that let's say the quarantine time when it started, it was the right thing to do in Ukraine. At that time, we didn't have let's say that much people infected, and all the measures taken since then, I believe they are correct, and they are needed for the country and for this lockdown, which we should have with the pandemic situation. And in comparison to other countries also in Europe, like Italy, it's better to have this quarantine time earlier than it hit all the country, and you can't even influence that, not at that time. So I believe that was done correctly and timely. And of course, yeah, for sure, lots of businesses they suffered from that, especially this let's say HoReCa industry, the entertainment, restaurants, hotels, and so on. Yeah, for sure. And we will see how many of them will recover. And for sure, I believe in 2008, 2009, maybe even more businesses of that type, they came dead.
They came back.
Yeah. So let's see what we have. And I also wanted to say over here that with the, let's say, with the restaurants and some of the entertainment industry over here, we have a lot of them in the working in also in gray economy, and maybe this is time for them, or after in this post-COVID period, it would be better for them also to assess how to pay all the taxes, and maybe in this situation to receive also the laws the government what provided and offered now for the enterprises. Because when you let's say in the restaurants, you also know when you go to the restaurant, you may have two recipes, one for the SPD, POP, and the second one for the legal entity. And let's say not everybody is paying taxes in this situation, but if you need to get a loan with a bank, you need to show all your financial figures. So you'd better have everything on your legal entity, on your company.
So the government didn't need to give a tax holiday. Many people are taking them. Does everybody agree with Olga? Are you confident in the way the government's performing through this crisis?
I think that the government does have some fiscal space, and it should use it. Cash payments to households that have lost serious income are an obvious remedy, both for sustaining demand and for preventing poverty. It's better than declaring a moratorium on penalties and disconnection for consumers relating utility payments, right? The state should pay up the tab. And even for companies, I think that small companies, again, if they would be viable but for COVID, right, and have no access to banking funding, again, there's a case for government putting money in, if necessary in the form of grants. But it should not be limited automatically to small companies. There's nothing wrong with large companies. Right? They have more easy access to banks, so they may not need official support. But if they would be viable except for the COVID virus, right? And if a bankruptcy or a default corporate reorganization would be unnecessarily costly, then the government can inject money, possibly in exchange for an equity stake. That's how the citizen, the taxpayer, gets his and her money back. So I think that there is enough space to spend a few percentage points of GDP on cash support for households and corporates. And they should use it for that. And if necessary, print the money.
Thanks. Jason, we have a question for you.
Oh, okay.
Jason, I'll let you take the floor, but the question for you is, the economic recovery needs massive foreign investment, but who would risk coming here while the rule of law and the anti-corruption authorities are so unpredictable? It's a good question.
So, FDI has always been a bit of a challenge for Ukraine. But I think it comes back to your question posed to us is what can government do on the messaging front? And the simplest answer to that question is further the reforms. That's what investors are looking for. Investors want to see the IMF program move forward. That gives confidence to the other IFI lenders, and it gives confidence to the debt capital markets, and it gives confidence to foreign strategic investors. What I've seen since I've been in the country for 3 years is if you build a project and you tender it out competitively, there is demand from good blue chip foreign investors to come into Ukraine. And again, coming back to the two port examples of Olbia and Kherson, we've demonstrated that we can do this. So with government support in furthering the reforms and an IFI like IFC taking the lead to structure and tender, I'm confident that we'll succeed in bringing in foreign investors, but not only foreign investors, creating a better investment climate for both domestic investors and foreign investors.
All right, thanks, Jason. We're at the hour, and if this goes on for much, I think we're all psychologically, it sounds like, prepared that this is going to go on for months and that the recovery is going to go through stages. And so hopefully we'll have you back again sometime. We are going to, this will be on the Kyiv Post YouTube channel. Again, I want to thank DTEK, the organizer, and now we'll move, I guess, and it's Friday night at 7:30. We'll move from, we can move to Zoom happy hour, but you guys are all people I would like to have a Friday night drink with. So sorry we can't meet in person, but I'm glad we met here, and I can't thank you enough for sharing your time, your expertise, for distilling the wisdom that all of you have acquired. And let's see where we're at on May 12th, I guess, is the next benchmark deadline for all of us. Until then, stay safe, stay home, keep your masks on, wash your hands, and subscribe to the Kyiv Post.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Enjoy the weekend.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Stay healthy.
And buy their books, those guys. They have great books.
All of them.
Mass quantities.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Enjoy your weekend.